They mocked him, a simple gardener with calloused hands and dirt-streaked clothes, when he dared to fall in love with a wealthy heiress. To them, it was absurd, even laughable. The grand Harrington Manor, with its marble staircases and crystal chandeliers, was no place for someone like him. And yet, love doesn't ask permission. It simply takes root, even in the most barren soil. Ooh. The first time Alex Monroe saw Lillian Harrington, she was standing by the edge of the rose garden, her delicate hands grazing the petals of a blooming red rose. She seemed to be searching for something amidst the blooms, her expression thoughtful yet distant. To Alex, she looked out of place, too refined for the rugged edges of the garden, like an intricate porcelain doll placed on uneven terrain. Yet there was something about her that drew him in, something beyond her beauty. It was the sadness in her eyes, a quiet yearning that resonated with his own longing for something more. Lillian's life was one of perfection on the surface, but beneath it lay a suffocating existence. Raised to embody grace and propriety, she spent her days entertaining shallow conversations with suitors handpicked by her father, Richard Harrington. To Richard, Lillian's future was as meticulously planned as the architecture of their manor. She was to marry a man of wealth and influence, someone who could bolster the Harrington legacy. Love, as far as Richard was concerned, was an irrelevant and impractical detail. Alex was hired to tend to the sprawling gardens of the estate, a job he took with quiet pride. He had an eye for beauty in the simplest things, an ability to coax life out of neglected soil and turn dying plants into thriving blooms. The garden was his sanctuary, and he poured his heart into every shrub and flower bed. It was here, amidst the roses and lavender bushes, that he found solace from the harshness of the world. He never imagined that the same garden would lead him into a connection that would change his life forever. It started with a simple conversation. Lillian had come to the garden one afternoon, escaping the stifling atmosphere of the manor. She stood by the climbing roses, watching Alex work with quiet curiosity. When their eyes met, there was a flicker of surprise in hers, as if she hadn't expected to be noticed. "You're very dedicated," she said, breaking the silence. Alex straightened, brushing the dirt off his hands. "The garden doesn't care who you are. If you take care of it, it gives back." Lillian tilted her head, intrigued by the simplicity of his words. "And if you don't?" "Withers," Alex replied, his voice steady. "But sometimes even withered things can bloom again, if given a chance." There was a moment of silence as his words hung in the air. For Lillian, they carried a weight she hadn't expected. She looked at the roses, their vibrant red petals standing in stark contrast to the wilted bushes nearby. "I suppose that's true," she said softly, almost to herself. From that day on, Lillian began to visit the garden more frequently. At first, their interactions were brief, passing comments about the weather or the state of the plants. But gradually, their conversations grew deeper. They talked about the constraints of their lives, the dreams they held but didn't dare to voice aloud. Alex spoke of his childhood, of the small patch of land his family had owned where he had first discovered his love for gardening. Lillian, in turn, shared her frustrations with the rigid expectations placed upon her, her desire to find meaning beyond the glittering facade of her world. Their bond grew in the quiet hours of the morning, before the household awoke, and in the golden light of the evening, when the garden was bathed in hues of orange and pink. Alex showed Lillian how to care for the plants, teaching her the patience and tenderness required to nurture life. She, in turn, shared her love of art, sketching the garden as it transformed under Alex's care. But as their connection deepened, so did the scrutiny. Richard Harrington had noticed his daughter's frequent absences from the social gatherings he arranged. He had heard whispers from the servants about her time spent in the garden, and he was not pleased. To him, the very idea of Lillian associating with someone like Alex was an affront to their family's name. One evening, as Lillian and Alex sat on a bench beneath the shade of an old oak tree, their laughter carrying through the garden, Richard appeared. His presence was as cold and commanding as ever, his sharp gaze cutting through the warmth of the moment. "Lillian," he said, his tone clipped, "a word?" Lillian rose reluctantly, her eyes meeting Alex's briefly before she followed her father. Richard led her back to the manor, his silence more intimidating than any words. When they reached the study, he closed the door and turned to face her. "Explain yourself," he demanded. Lillian squared her shoulders, refusing to cower under his glare. "There's nothing to explain, Father. I was in the garden." Lillian's voice was calm but firm. "Do you mean the same people who smile at us during dinners and whisper behind our backs the moment we turn away? Those people?" Richard's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "You are my daughter, Lillian. You have a responsibility to this family, to our legacy. That gardener is nothing. He has no place in your life." Lillian's gaze didn't waver. "He has more integrity than anyone in that ballroom you parade me through." Richard's face darkened, his composure slipping. "This ends now," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You will not see him again." But Lillian knew in her heart that she couldn't obey. For the first time in her life, she felt alive, truly alive, and she wasn't willing to let that go. Meanwhile, Alex faced his own challenges. Word of his connection with Lillian had spread among the servants, and their disapproval was palpable. He found himself the target of sneers and whispered insults, but he bore it with quiet dignity. His love for Lillian was worth any hardship, and he was determined to prove it. As the days turned into weeks, the tension within Harrington Manor grew. Lillian and Alex continued to meet in secret, their bond strengthening with every stolen moment. But they both knew that their time was running out. Richard's watchful eye and the judgment of society loomed over them like a storm cloud, threatening to tear them apart. One fateful evening, as the garden was bathed in the soft light of the setting sun, Alex made a decision. He took Lillian's hands in his eyes searching hers with unwavering resolve. "I love you, Lillian," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I won't let anyone take that away from us. But I need to know if you feel the same." Lillian's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she nodded. "I do, Alex. I love you more than anything." With that, Alex made her a promise to build a life together, no matter the odds. And so they began to plan their escape, a daring act of defiance against a world that sought to keep them apart. But love, as they would soon discover, was only the beginning of their journey. The road ahead would test their strength, their courage, and their commitment to each other in ways they could never have imagined. As Alex and Lillian began to plan their escape, the garden became their haven, a place of whispered dreams and fragile hope. The sprawling roses, once a silent witness to their growing love, now bore the weight of their shared secret. Yet within the beauty of the garden, the tension of their situation remained palpable. Lillian's every move was scrutinized by the manor's ever-watchful eyes, while Alex worked tirelessly to save enough money for their new life together. One evening, as the moon cast a silver glow over the estate, Alex slipped into the garden, his heart racing. Lillian was waiting for him beneath the old oak tree, her figure silhouetted against the soft light. She turned as he approached, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I managed to speak with Martha," Alex began, his voice low but filled with urgency. Martha, one of the older maids in the manor, had taken a liking to Lillian over the years and was perhaps the only person they could trust. She said she could help us get a message to her cousin in the neighboring town. He owns a small inn where we could stay until we figure out our next steps. Lillian's brow furrowed as she considered his words. "But what about the money, Alex? You've been working so hard, but it's not enough yet." Alex reached for her hands, his touch reassuring. "I'll find a way. Even if I have to take on extra work in the evenings or sell my tools, I'll make sure we have enough." Their conversation was interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps crunching against the gravel. Both Alex and Lillian froze, their hearts pounding in unison. The garden was supposed to be deserted at this hour, yet the approaching sound betrayed an uninvited presence. "Ek," Lillian whispered, tugging Alex behind the thick hedges of the rose garden. They crouched low, their breaths shallow as the footsteps drew nearer. A shadow loomed across the pathway, and Alex recognized the stern figure of Richard Harrington. Richard paused by the oak tree, his gaze scanning the area with suspicion. Though he couldn't see them, his instincts told him that something was amiss. He stood there for what felt like an eternity before finally turning and walking away, his retreating footsteps echoing into the night. Lillian exhaled a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around Alex's. "He knows," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He doesn't have proof yet, but he knows." Alex's jaw clenched, his determination hardening. "Then we need to act fast. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes." The following days were fraught with tension. Richard's suspicions grew, and he began to take steps to keep Lillian under closer watch. He instructed the servants to report her movements and even arranged for Michael Gaines, a wealthy suitor, to visit the manor more frequently. Michael's presence was a calculated move, a way to remind Lillian of her expected role and to steer her away from the gardener who had captured her heart. Michael was everything Lillian despised: arrogant, entitled, and utterly devoid of genuine kindness. He strutted through the manor as if he already owned it, his condescending remarks grating on Lillian's nerves. During one particularly uncomfortable dinner, he leaned across the table with a smirk. "So, Lillian," he began, his tone dripping with smugness, "I hear you've taken quite an interest in gardening lately. How charming. I suppose it's a quaint way to pass the time while you await more significant responsibilities." Lillian's eyes narrowed, her composure wavering for a moment. "Gardening teaches patience and care," she replied evenly. "Qualities I find lacking in many of the so-called responsibilities society deems significant." Michael's smirk faltered, but before he could retort, Richard interjected with a forced laugh. Now, Lillian, Michael was only making light conversation. There's no need to take offense." Lillian forced a polite smile, but her heart burned with frustration. She longed to escape the suffocating constraints of her world, and her resolve to leave grew stronger with each passing day. Meanwhile, Alex faced his own challenges. Rumors of his connection with Lillian had reached the other workers, and their resentment was palpable. They muttered under their breaths as he passed, their disdain evident. One evening, as Alex was tending to the rose bushes, a group of young stable hands approached him, their expressions hostile. "They don't think you're better than the rest of us, don't you?" one of them sneered, catching the eye of the lady of the manor. "But don't forget, Monroe, you're just a gardener, nothing more." Alex straightened, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I've never claimed to be better than anyone," he replied. "I'm just doing my job." "Your job," another worker spat, stepping closer. "Maybe you should stick to it and stay away from things that don't concern you." Alex knew better than to escalate the situation, but their words only fueled his determination. He wouldn't let their hostility deter him. His love for Lillian was worth any challenge. As the days turned into weeks, Lillian and Alex's plans began to take shape. They coordinated their escape with Martha, who agreed to help smuggle Lillian out of the manor under the guise of a visit to a distant relative. Alex secured a small sum of money by selling his most prized gardening tools, a sacrifice he made without hesitation. The night of their escape arrived, and the atmosphere in the manor was heavy with tension. Lillian feigned a headache during dinner, excusing herself early to retire to her room. Alex waited in the garden, his heart racing as he glanced at the clock tower in the distance. Every minute felt like an eternity. Finally, Lillian appeared, a small bag slung over her shoulder and her expression resolute. "Are you ready?" Alex asked, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within him. Lillian nodded. More than ever. They made their way to the back gate of the estate, where Martha was waiting with a small cart. The older maid handed Lillian a shawl to cover her face and offered Alex a reassuring nod. "Take care of her," she said quietly, "and don't look back." As the cart rolled away from the estate, Lillian and Alex held hands tightly, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. For the first time, they felt the stirrings of freedom, a fragile but precious hope that they clung to with all their might. But their journey was far from over. The road ahead was fraught with challenges, and the shadow of Richard Harrington's wrath loomed large. As the cart disappeared into the night, the distant glow of Harrington Manor faded behind them, leaving only the uncertainty of the future. Little did they know, Richard had already discovered their absence. When he entered Lillian's room and found it empty, his fury was uncontainable. He summoned the servants, demanding answers, and it wasn't long before Martha's involvement was uncovered. Though she refused to reveal their destination, Richard vowed to find them, his anger fueled by a sense of betrayal and the loss of control over his daughter. Meanwhile, Alex and Lillian arrived at the small inn owned by Martha's cousin, a modest but welcoming place nestled in the heart of the neighboring town. The innkeeper, a kind man named Samuel, offered them a room and promised to keep their presence a secret. For the first time in weeks, Alex and Lillian allowed themselves to relax, if only slightly. They sat together by the window, watching the stars twinkle above the quiet town. Lillian rested her head on Alex's shoulder, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "We've come this far," she murmured, "but what happens now?" Alex wrapped his arm around her, his voice steady and reassuring. "We take it one step at a time. We'll find work, build a life together, and prove to everyone that our love is stronger than their doubts." As they drifted off to sleep, the distant sound of hooves echoed through the town, a reminder that their journey was just beginning. The road ahead would test their love and resilience, but together, they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The quiet inn nestled in the heart of the neighboring town became both a refuge and a proving ground for Alex and Lillian. Though the simple accommodations lacked the opulence of Harrington Manor, they found solace in the absence of scrutiny. Their days were filled with whispers of hope and careful planning, yet the shadow of their departure still loomed. Lillian quickly adapted to the modest life the inn provided, finding joy in the small, everyday moments she had long been denied. She helped Samuel with chores around the inn, learning to cook, clean, and care for guests. Though her hands, once accustomed to nothing more strenuous than brushing a canvas, became roughened by the work, she cherished the newfound sense of independence. Alex, ever resourceful, secured a job at a nearby farm tending to fields and livestock. The work was grueling, but he approached it with the same quiet determination he had always shown. Each evening, he returned to the inn with aching muscles and dirt-streaked clothes, his spirits buoyed by Lillian's smile and their shared dreams. But their newfound peace was fragile, and both knew it. Richard Harrington was a man who did not tolerate defiance, and Lillian's departure was an affront he could not ignore. His network of influence extended far beyond Harrington Manor, and it wasn't long before whispers of his search reached the small town. But one morning, as Lillian was arranging fresh flowers in the inn's modest dining room, Samuel entered with a troubled expression. He glanced at her, hesitating before he spoke. "Lillian, we need to talk." Her heart sank at his tone. Setting down the bouquet, she wiped her hands on her apron and followed him to the back room. Alex was already there, his face tense with worry. Samuel closed the door behind them, his voice low as he explained. "Richard Harrington has sent word to nearby towns, offering a reward for information about your whereabouts. He's hired men to ask questions, and they've already visited the next town over. It's only a matter of time before they come here." Lillian's breath caught in her throat. She glanced at Alex, who reached for her hand, his grip firm and steady. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Samuel sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "You can't stay here much longer. It's too risky. I have a friend who owns a cabin deep in the woods, far from the main roads. It's not much, but it'll be safe." Alex nodded, his jaw set with resolve. "We'll go. Thank you, Samuel. We'll leave tonight." As night fell, Alex and Lillian prepared to leave the inn. Samuel provided them with a small cart and a horse along with supplies for the journey. The cabin was a 2-day ride through dense forest, and the path would be treacherous. Yet as they set off under the cover of darkness, their hearts were filled with determination. The forest was both beautiful and foreboding. Moonlight filtered through the canopy of trees, casting dappled shadows on the narrow path. The air was cool and filled with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant hoots of owls. Lillian sat close to Alex, her head resting on his shoulder as the cart creaked along the uneven terrain. As they traveled deeper into the forest, the sense of isolation grew. The trees closed in around them, their branches forming an almost impenetrable wall. Yet, within this isolation, they found a sense of freedom. For the first time, they were truly alone, far from the prying eyes and expectations of society. By the second day, the journey began to take its toll. The path became rougher and the horse grew weary. Lillian took turns walking alongside Alex, her once pristine boots caked in mud. They spoke little, conserving their energy as they pressed on toward the cabin. When they finally arrived, the sight of the small wooden structure nestled among the trees filled them with relief. The cabin was modest, with a single room and a small fireplace, but it was enough. They set to work immediately, cleaning the space and making it their own. Alex chopped wood for the fire while Lillian arranged the few belongings they had brought with them. That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, they sat together on the simple cot that served as their bed. Lillian leaned against Alex, her voice soft. "Do you think we'll ever be free from his reach?" Alex wrapped an arm around her, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "We've already come so far. He can't take this from us. As long as we have each other, we'll find a way." Their words were filled with conviction, yet they both knew the road ahead would not be easy. The cabin offered safety for now, but Richard Harrington was not a man who gave up easily. His influence extended far and wide, and his men were relentless in their search. Days turned into weeks, and Alex and Lillian settled into a new routine. They hunted and foraged for food, learning to live off the land. Lillian, who had once known only the luxuries of high society, discovered a newfound strength within herself. She learned to set traps for small game and gathered herbs to season their meals. Alex, ever practical, taught her how to navigate the forest and identify edible plants. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. In the quiet of the forest, they found a love that was unshaken by the hardships they faced. Yet, beneath their happiness lay a constant undercurrent of tension. They knew their time in the cabin was temporary, and the threat of discovery loomed like a dark cloud. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Alex returned from a hunting trip with a troubled expression. Lillian met him at the door, her concern immediate. "What is it?" she asked, searching his face. Alex hesitated before speaking. "I saw smoke in the distance. It's not from our fire. Someone else is out there." Lillian's heart raced. "Do you think it's—" "I don't know," Alex admitted, his voice grim. "But we need to be cautious. If they're looking for us, we can't stay here." That night, they kept the fire low and took turns keeping watch. Alex sat by the window, his eyes scanning the dark forest for any sign of movement. Lillian tried to rest, but sleep eluded her. The faint sound of rustling leaves outside sent her heart racing, though it was likely just the wind. As dawn broke, they decided to investigate. Alex led the way, his knife in hand, while Lillian followed closely behind. They moved silently through the forest, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. When they reached the source of the smoke, they found a small campsite. A group of men sat around the fire, their rough appearances marking them as hired hands. Lillian's breath caught as she recognized one of the men from Harrington Manor, a stable hand who had always been loyal to Richard. She turned to Alex, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to leave," she whispered. "They'll find us if we stay." Alex nodded, his expression resolute. "We'll pack our things and move deeper into the forest. They won't find us." But as they turned to leave, a twig snapped beneath Lillian's foot, the sound cutting through the morning air like a gunshot. The men at the campsite turned, their eyes narrowing as they scanned the trees. "There!" one of them shouted, pointing in their direction. Alex grabbed Lillian's hand, pulling her as they broke into a run. The forest blurred around them as they sprinted through the dense undergrowth, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The sound of pursuit grew louder, the men crashing through the trees behind them. As they ran, Alex's mind raced. He knew the forest well, but the men were gaining on them. They needed a plan, and fast. Spotting a narrow ravine ahead, he pulled Lillian toward it. Down here, he urged, helping her slide down the steep embankment. They crouched low, hidden by the thick foliage, as the sound of their pursuers grew closer. The men stopped at the edge of the ravine, their voices carrying through the trees. They couldn't have gone far. Spread out and keep looking. Alex and Lillian held their breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the men searched the area. Finally, the sound of footsteps receded, and the forest grew quiet once more. Alex exhaled slowly, his grip on Lillian's hand tightening. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice low but steady. "We need to keep moving." Lillian nodded, her resolve unwavering despite the fear that lingered in her chest. Together, they climbed out of the ravine and continued deeper into the forest, their love and determination guiding them toward an uncertain but hopeful future. The forest thickened as Alex and Lillian pressed on, each step taking them deeper into the heart of the wilderness. The world they once knew seemed like a distant memory, their days and nights now governed by the rhythm of survival. They knew the men searching for them wouldn't give up easily, but their resolve to stay hidden and protect what they had built together only grew stronger. By mid-afternoon, the couple reached a small clearing. It was encircled by towering pine trees, their needles forming a soft carpet on the forest floor. Alex surveyed the area, his sharp eyes scanning for any signs of danger before finally nodding. "This will have to do for now," he said, setting down the small bundle of supplies they had managed to grab before fleeing the cabin. Lillian wiped a bead of sweat from her brow, her breath still uneven from their hasty escape. "We'll need to set up some kind of shelter," she said, her voice steady despite the fear still lingering in her chest. Alex nodded, already pulling out the makeshift tools they had brought with them. "We'll build something temporary tonight," he said, glancing at the fading sunlight filtering through the trees. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out a more permanent plan." The two of them worked tirelessly, their movements synchronized as they gathered branches, leaves, and vines to construct a simple lean-to. Though it was far from the comfort of the cabin, it provided a small sense of security. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Alex lit a small, concealed fire, its faint glow barely visible beneath the dense canopy of trees. They sat together by the fire, sharing a quiet meal of dried meat and berries. Lillian's hands trembled slightly as she held her tin cup of water, the events of the day replaying in her mind. Alex reached over, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "We'll get through this," he said softly, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of uncertainty. Lillian looked at him, her eyes reflecting both gratitude and determination. "I know," she said, her voice firm. "As long as we're together, we'll find a way." The night passed uneventfully, though both Alex and Lillian took turns keeping watch. The forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, their calls and rustles blending into a symphony of the wild. Though the fear of being discovered lingered, the couple found solace in the natural world around them. The following morning, Alex woke early, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the dense foliage. He stretched his sore muscles before glancing at Lillian, who was still asleep beside him. Her face, though streaked with dirt and exhaustion, radiated a quiet strength that filled him with admiration. Not wanting to wake her, Alex set off to explore the surrounding area. He moved silently through the forest, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of pine needles. As he walked, he studied the terrain, noting potential hiding spots and escape routes. He also kept an eye out for fresh water and signs of game, knowing they would need to replenish their supplies soon. After about an hour, Alex stumbled upon a small stream. The crystal clear water sparkled in the sunlight, and the gentle babbling of the current brought a sense of calm. He knelt by the stream, filling his canteen and splashing cool water on his face. As he stood, he noticed tracks along the muddy bank. They were faint but unmistakable. Deer tracks. A faint smile crossed his lips as he realized the stream could provide both water and food for them. When Alex returned to the clearing, Lillian was awake and tending to the fire. She looked up at him, her expression softening as she saw the canteen in his hand. "Find anything useful?" she asked, taking the canteen and drinking deeply. Alex nodded. "There's a stream not far from here. We can use it for water, and I saw some deer tracks." I'll set up some traps later today." Lillian smiled, a flicker of hope lighting her eyes. "That's good news. We'll need all the resources we can get." The rest of the day was spent preparing their temporary camp. Alex crafted a series of snares and traps, carefully setting them along the deer trails he had discovered. Lillian, meanwhile, focused on organizing their supplies and fortifying the lean-to. She even began gathering wild herbs and edible plants, relying on the knowledge Alex had shared with her during their time at the cabin. As the days turned into weeks, Alex and Lillian adapted to their new life in the forest. Their bond grew stronger with each challenge they faced, their love a source of strength in the face of adversity. The forest, once an unfamiliar and daunting place, became their sanctuary, a world where they could live on their own terms, free from the constraints of society. But their peace was short-lived. One evening, as the couple sat by the fire, a faint noise reached Alex's ears. He held up a hand, signaling Lillian to stay silent. The sound came again, a distant rustling, followed by the faint crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. Alex's heart raced as he extinguished the fire, plunging their camp into darkness. He gestured for Lillian to follow him, and the two of them slipped into the shadows, their movements silent and deliberate. They crouched behind a thicket of bushes, their breaths shallow as they listened. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by low voices. Alex could make out at least 3 distinct figures, their silhouettes barely visible through the trees. His mind raced as he tried to determine their next move. If these men were part of Richard's search party, they couldn't afford to be discovered. As the figures drew closer, Alex spotted a familiar face among them. It was the same stable hand from Harrington Manor, the man they had seen at the campsite days earlier. Alex's grip on Lillian's hand tightened as he realized the men were following their trail. The search party stopped near the clearing, their voices growing louder. "They were here," one of the men said, his tone gruff. "The fire's still warm, they can't be far." Another man nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife. "Spread out, they're probably hiding nearby." Alex's mind raced as he assessed their options. They couldn't stay hidden forever, and attempting to flee would only give away their position. He glanced at Lillian, her wide eyes reflecting her fear, and made a decision. Leaning close, he whispered, "Stay here. Don't move until it's safe." Before she could protest, Alex slipped away, moving silently through the shadows. He circled around the search party, his heart pounding as he approached from behind. Picking up a small rock, he hurled it into the distance, the sound of it striking a tree echoing through the forest. The men immediately turned toward the noise, their attention diverted. "Over there," one of them shouted, and they began moving in the direction of the sound. Taking advantage of the distraction, Alex returned to Lillian's side. "Come on," he whispered, helping her to her feet. "We need to move." The two of them crept away from the clearing, their movements slow and deliberate. The forest seemed to close in around them, every shadow and rustle sending shivers down their spines. Though the men were still nearby, their attention was focused on the wrong direction, giving Alex and Lillian a chance to escape. After what felt like hours, the couple finally stopped to catch their breath. They had put considerable distance between themselves and the search party, but the danger was far from over. Alex scanned the area, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of pursuit, before finally relaxing. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice low. "They're not far behind." His face relaxed. Lillian nodded, her face pale but determined. "I trust you," she said simply, her words filled with unwavering conviction. As they continued their journey through the forest, Alex and Lillian knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. Yet, their love and resilience gave them the strength to keep going. No matter what lay ahead, they were determined to face it together, knowing that their bond was unbreakable. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, there's another must-see video on screen now. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss out on more incredible content.